In the spring of 2012, archaeologists digging in a cellar pit inside the original James Fort uncovered a skull and a set of leg bones that did not belong together, cut in a manner no butcher would use on an animal. The bones belonged to a 14-year-old girl. Forensic anthropologists at the Smithsonian, led by Douglas Owsley, examined the marks. The cuts along the skull and shin were consistent with an attempt to remove flesh after death, not before. The find, announced in May of 2013, became the first physical proof of something the colony's own leaders had written about, but that later historians spent centuries trying not to believe. During the winter of 1609 into 1610, the English colonists at Jamestown ate their own dead to survive. Historians call that winter the starving time. Of roughly 500 people living inside the fort in the autumn of 1609, perhaps 60 were still alive by the following May. Most of the 500 did not simply vanish from the record. Their names were logged on ship manifests, in company ledgers, in the muster that Virginia's government took more than a decade later to account for who had lived and who had not. A small number of surnames carried through that winter and into the generations that followed. And if your family has roots that reach back into early Virginia, into the Tidewater counties, into the old plantation lines of James City and Surrey and Charles City, there is a real chance one of those surnames sits somewhere in your own family tree. Today we are going to walk through 15 of them, the surnames of the men, women, and children documented to have survived Jamestown's starving time, and what happened to the families who carried those names forward. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Jamestown was not yet 3 years old when the starving time began. The Virginia Company had landed 104 settlers on a marshy peninsula in the James River in May of 1607, a location chosen more for its defensibility against Spanish ships than for its soil or its water supply. The site was swampy, the well brackish, and the surrounding land belonged to Tsenacomoco, the confederation of some 30 Algonquian-speaking groups under the paramount chief the English called Powhatan. For the colony's first 2 years, survival depended on trade with Powhatan's towns for corn, supplemented by supply ships from England that arrived unreliably and often carried more mouths to feed than food to feed them. By the summer of 1609, relations with Powhatan's people had collapsed into open hostility. Captain John Smith, whose ruthless trading tactics had kept the colony fed through intimidation as much as diplomacy, was badly burned in a gunpowder accident and sailed for England that October, leaving the fort without the one leader Powhatan's warriors had learned to respect. Powhatan responded to Smith's departure by tightening a blockade around James Fort, refusing trade, and picking off colonists who ventured beyond the palisade to fish or forage. A relief fleet that should have restocked the fort that summer had been scattered by a hurricane in the Atlantic. Its flagship, the Sea Venture, wrecked on Bermuda, stranding the colony's newly appointed leadership on an island 600 miles away, while Jamestown entered the winter with a fraction of the food it needed and no way to leave the fort to find more. What followed is recorded in the words of the man left in charge. George Percy, the youngest son of the 8th Earl of Northumberland, became president of the council when Smith sailed, and it fell to him to govern a fort that was starving under siege. In an account he wrote years later, Percy described colonists eating the leather from their shoes, boiling starch from their collars, and digging up the graves of the recently dead for meat. He wrote of one man who murdered his pregnant wife, salted the body, and was executed once the crime was discovered, a case corroborated separately in later Virginia Company records. By the time a small relief party finally reached the fort in May of 1610, the population that had stood near 500 the previous autumn had fallen to somewhere between 60 and 90. The survivors were in such a state that Sir Thomas Gates, arriving from the Bermuda wreck with the stranded leadership, initially ordered the entire colony abandoned. The ships had already turned downriver toward the Atlantic when they met an incoming supply fleet under the newly appointed governor, Lord de la Warr, who ordered the colonists back to the fort rather than let 3 years of investment collapse into nothing. Jamestown survived, but only because a small number of individuals had survived first, and it is their names, drawn from Percy's own writings, from Virginia Company ledgers, and from the sworn muster the colony's government took in 1624 and 1625 to account for who remained alive from the earliest years, that make up the 15 surnames we are tracing today. Not every name on this list can be tied to the starving time with equal certainty. Some are recorded explicitly as present through the winter. Others appear in the record just before it and again just after, with no surviving document placing them anywhere else in between, which is itself the ordinary condition of Jamestown's earliest years. Record-keeping in a fort under siege was not a priority, and what survives is partial by nature. Where the evidence is direct, we will say so. Where it depends on the gap between two dated appearances, we will say that too. Number 1. Percy. George Percy did not simply survive the starving time, he governed through it, and his account of that winter remains the single most detailed contemporary record historians have of what happened inside James Fort. Percy was the youngest son of an English earl, a gentleman with no experience running a starving colony, thrust into command when John Smith sailed for England in October of 1609. He held the presidency through the worst of the siege and stepped down when Sir Thomas Gates arrived from Bermuda the following May. Percy returned to Jamestown a second time in 1611 and again served briefly as acting governor before returning permanently to England, where he died without children in the 1630s. The Percy name did not build a Virginia dynasty the way some names on this list did, since George Percy left no direct American descendants of his own. But the Percy family's presence in the colony's founding records, and George Percy's own written account, 1625's A True Relation, remains one of the primary sources every historian of the starving time still relies on. If your family carries the Percy name and traces to early Virginia, the connection to this specific George Percy is worth checking against the documented line rather than assumed, since Percy was already a common English surname well before 1607. Number 2. Martin. John Martin was one of the original members of the colony's governing council, named in the Virginia Company's first charter, and he remained in Virginia through the starving time despite multiple opportunities to leave. Martin had sailed on the very first voyage in 1607, was wounded in early conflicts with Powhatan's warriors, and by his own later petitions to the company, spent considerable personal wealth trying to keep the colony provisioned. He survived the winter of 1609 into 1610 and continued serving on the council for years afterward, eventually receiving a large land grant at Martin's Brandon on the James River, a plantation that carried his name for generations. Martin is among the more thoroughly documented survivors on this list precisely because he spent the rest of his life fighting the Virginia Company and writing over money, leaving behind a paper trail most colonists of the period did not generate. His descendants remained prominent in Charles City County well into the 17th century. Martin is also one of the most common surnames in the English-speaking world, so a family Bible listing a Virginia Martin in the 17th century is suggestive rather than conclusive on its own, and the strongest connections tend to run through documented land patents rather than the name alone. Number 3. West. Francis West was the younger brother of Thomas West, Lord Delaware, the nobleman who would arrive with the relief fleet that saved the colony in the spring of 1610. Francis West himself had been in Virginia since 1608, and though he led a party away from the main fort earlier in 1609, on a mission to establish a second settlement at the Falls of the James, he returned to the main colony and is recorded among those present through the siege that winter. The West family's Virginia connections ran deep. After his brother's governorship ended, Francis West himself twice served as governor of the colony in 1627 and again briefly afterward, and the West family name became attached to West Point, Virginia, where the Mattapony and Pamunkey rivers meet to form the York. Genealogists researching a Virginia West line from this period should be cautious, since West functioned both as a surname carried into the colony and separately as a title borne by multiple family members who used variations of West, Delaware, and Delaware interchangeably in period records, which can make the documentary trail harder to follow than the name alone suggests. Number 4. Laydon. John Laydon arrived on the very first ships in 1607 as a bricklayer, one of the original 104 colonists, and in 1608 he married Anne Burras, the first English wedding recorded in Virginia. Both husband and wife survived the starving time, an achievement made rarer by the fact that they had at least one and possibly more children in the colony during these earliest years, and infant and child mortality during the siege was severe. Their daughter Virginia Laydon, born around 1609, is frequently cited as the first child born of English parents in Virginia, though the surviving record on her fate during the starving time itself is thin. John Laydon continued to appear in Virginia Company muster records into the 1620s, well past the ordinary survival rate for colonists of his arrival year, and the Laydon line is documented in later land records in James City County. The Laydon and Burras names together represent one of the few starving time survival stories involving a complete family unit rather than a single individual, which is part of why genealogists researching early Virginia lines pay particular attention to this couple. Number 5. Burras. Anne Burras arrived in Virginia in the autumn of 1608 as a maidservant to Mistress Forrest, part of the small second supply that brought some of the earliest English women to the colony. Mistress Forrest did not survive long in Virginia, but Anne Burras did, marrying John Laydon within months of her arrival and surviving the starving time alongside him the following year. Burras is a rare enough surname in English records that later Virginia appearances of the name, or its documented variant spelling Burrows, can often be traced with more confidence than a common name would allow. Company records list Anne Burras Laydon as still living in the colony in the 1620s, placing her among a small number of the earliest arriving English women documented to have survived both the disease-ridden first years of the colony's founding and the famine that nearly ended it in 1609 and 1610. Her survival, and her daughter's birth in the middle of that period, is one of the few points in the starving time record where the surviving documents let us follow an individual woman's story with any real detail, rather than the anonymous count of the dead that dominates most of Percy's own account. Number 6. Powell. Nathaniel Powell arrived with the first colonists in 1607 and became one of the more active explorers of the colony's early years, accompanying John Smith on expeditions up the Chickahominy and Potomac rivers. He served on the governing council and survived the starving time, continuing to hold positions of authority in the colony through the 1610s and into the 1620s. His story ends violently rather than quietly. Powell was among the roughly 340 colonists killed in the coordinated Powhatan uprising of March 1622, an attack that came close to destroying the colony a second time, 12 years after the famine nearly finished the job. Powell's death is documented in company records, naming him specifically among the casualties, alongside his wife. The Powell surname went on to become one of the most widespread names in Virginia and later the American South, carried by both English colonial families and, separately, by enslaved and free black families who took the name after emancipation, which means a modern Powell surname search requires more specific documentation, land records, church registers, wills, to connect confidently back to this particular Nathaniel Powell, rather than simply the surname's general prevalence. Number 7. Peirce. Sometimes recorded as Peirce or Peirce. Captain William Peirce arrived in Virginia around 1609 and survived the starving time to become one of the colony's most prosperous early planters. He later served as a captain of the guard and eventually as acting governor of Bermuda, and his Jamestown plantation, known for its orchards and gardens, was described by visitors as among the finest in the colony. Peirce's daughter, often recorded as Joan or Jane Peirce, married John Rolfe in 1619, 2 years after Rolfe's first wife, Pocahontas, had died in England, connecting the Peirce family directly into one of the most documented lineages in early Virginia history. The Peirce name carried forward through multiple branches of Tidewater Virginia gentry, and because William Peirce's landholdings and family connections were extensively recorded by the Virginia Company and by later colonial courts, the Peirce line from this period is among the better documented survivor families on this list, with far less ambiguity than a common surname like Martin or Powell carries. Number 8. Spelman. Henry Spelman was only about 14 years old when he arrived in Virginia in 1609, sent by colony leadership to live among Powhatan's people and learn the Powhatan language as an interpreter, a practice the English used with several boys during this period. Spelman's placement meant he was physically absent from James Fort for much of the worst of the starving time, living instead in Powhatan towns, which almost certainly saved his life given the mortality rate inside the fort that winter. He returned to English settlement afterward and went on to write one of the only surviving first-hand English accounts of Powhatan society from this early period, a short manuscript rediscovered centuries later and now considered a valuable, if imperfect, source for historians. Spelman's later life was violent and short. He served as an interpreter for years afterward and was killed in 1623 during a conflict with the Chesapeake tribe he had been sent to negotiate with. But his account of the starving time years and his survival through a boyhood spent between two cultures at war makes the Spelman name one of the more unusual entries on this list. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Number 9. Savage. Thomas Savage was even younger than Spelman, roughly 13 years old, when Captain Christopher Newport gave him to Powhatan in an exchange of boys intended to build trust between the two peoples in 1607, 2 years before the starving time began. Savage lived among the Powhatan through the famine winter, learning the language and the country in ways few English colonists ever would, and his position outside the fort again likely spared him the starvation and disease-killing colonists inside the palisade. He later became one of colonial Virginia's most valuable interpreters and, unlike many figures on this list, lived to old age, dying around 1633 after decades of service bridging English and Powhatan communities on the eastern shore, where he was eventually granted land of his own. The Savage family name persisted in Virginia's eastern shore counties for generations afterward, and because Thomas Savage's land grants and later court appearances are relatively well documented compared to other early colonists, families researching a Savage surname with roots in Accomack or Northampton County have a genuinely strong documentary trail to follow back toward this specific individual. Number 10. Collier. Samuel Collier arrived in Virginia in 1607 as a boy, recorded among the original page boys attached to the colony's leadership, and like Spelman and Savage, he spent time among Powhatan's people, learning the language during the colony's earliest years. Collier survived the starving time and continued to appear in Virginia's records for years afterward, listed in the muster taken in 1624 as still living in the colony, a record that places his survival beyond dispute, since it names him directly 17 years after his arrival and 14 years after the famine that killed most of his fellow colonists. Little else about Collier's personal life survives in detail, no wife, no children clearly attributed to him in the extant record, which is itself common for colonists who did not acquire significant land or hold council positions that generated paperwork. Collier's case illustrates something important about this entire list. Survival through the starving time did not guarantee a documented family line forward. Some names on this countdown built visible dynasties. Others simply persisted in the record long enough to prove the person lived, without leaving a traceable genealogy behind them at all. Number 11. Poole. Robert Poole, sometimes recorded as Old Poole to distinguish him from later Virginia colonists of the same name, was among the earliest English settlers to develop working knowledge of Powhatan's language and customs, and he is recorded serving as an interpreter for the colony across multiple years spanning the starving time period. Poole's exact arrival date is less firmly fixed in surviving records than some names on this list, which is why his connection to the starving time specifically rests more on the gap in the record, present before the winter of 1609, present again afterward, than on a single document placing him inside the fort during the siege itself. This is the kind of case the earlier caveat about record survival was written for. Poole's later career as an interpreter and go-between placed him at the center of several documented incidents in Anglo-Powhatan relations through the 1610s, and the Poole surname appears in James City County land records into the following decades. A modern Poole family researching Virginia roots should treat the starving time connection as probable rather than certain, a more honest position than the certainty this list can offer for names like Percy or Collier. Number 12. Waters. Edward Waters holds a distinction almost no one else on this list can claim. He was aboard the Sea Venture when it wrecked on Bermuda in July of 1609. Survived nearly a year stranded on that island, alongside the colony's incoming leadership, and then sailed on to Jamestown with the relief fleet in May of 1610, arriving just as the starving time was ending, rather than surviving the famine from inside the fort itself. His case sits deliberately outside the strict boundary of this list, and we include him because his name illustrates how tightly connected the Bermuda shipwreck and the Jamestown famine actually were in the documentary record. Two disasters separated by an ocean and tied together by the same starving colony waiting on the far side of it. Waters later returned to Bermuda, where records show him surviving a second shipwreck years afterward, becoming something of a minor legend among Bermuda's earliest chroniclers for his repeated survival of maritime disaster. Families with Waters' ancestry connecting to either early Bermuda or early Virginia settlement should know that both branches of the documented record, the Sea Venture wreck and the Jamestown relief, involve this same individual. Number 13. Ratcliffe, born Sycamore. John Ratcliffe served as president of the Jamestown Council before George Percy, and the man who held that title through the very beginning of the crisis that became the starving time was, by several surviving accounts, not born with the name history remembers him by. Ratcliffe appears to have adopted the name after arriving in the colonies, his birth surname recorded in some period documents as Sycamore, a detail modern historians still debate, rather than one this account can present as fully settled. Whatever his birth name, Ratcliffe survived long enough to see the siege begin and hand off the presidency to Percy, but he did not survive it entirely. In the spring of 1610, right around the point the starving time is usually said to end, Ratcliffe led a trading expedition to Powhatan's town seeking corn, and was captured, tortured, and killed, one of the war's final casualties before the colony's brief evacuation and rescue. His death sits close enough to the boundary of the starving time that most historians of the period discuss it in the same breath, and his adopted name is a reminder that even a documented Jamestown surname is not always the family's original one. Number 14. Todkill. Annas Todkill was a soldier in the original Jamestown garrison whose name survives today almost entirely because he contributed written passages to John Smith's later published account of the colony's early years, portions of the general history that Smith himself credited to Todkill and several other named colonists, rather than claiming sole authorship. Todkill's own presence through the starving time is documented through his continued appearance in company muster listings from the surrounding years, though like Poole, the precise day-by-day record of his location during the siege itself has not survived. Todkill is among the rarer surnames on this list, uncommon enough in English parish records that a family researching Todkill ancestry connecting to early Virginia would be working with an unusually narrow and traceable name, assuming any documented line survived past the colony's first decades, which is not itself confirmed in the surviving Virginia land and court records available to researchers today. We include Todkill here less because his survival tells a dramatic story, and more because his own writing is part of why we know as much as we do about what the starving time was actually like inside the fort. Number 15. Fettiplace. William Fettiplace came from an established English gentry family and arrived in Virginia in the colony's early years, surviving the starving time and going on to serve in positions of authority within the colonial government through the 1610s. The Fettiplace name is unusual among this list for its clear English gentry pedigree, well documented in Berkshire and Oxfordshire records going back generations before anyone in the family set foot in Virginia, which makes the American branch, when it can be confidently traced, one of the more genealogically secure entries here. Fettiplace's Virginia line did not become one of the colony's dominant dynasties in the way the Peirce or West families did, and the name grows rare in Virginia's later colonial records, suggesting the American branch either died out, returned to England, or continued under a variant spelling that has not been firmly connected back by researchers. Rare surnames cut both ways in genealogy. They are easier to trace with confidence when the record survives, and they are more likely to vanish from the historical record entirely when a single generation fails to produce documented children. 15 surnames, and behind every one of them a documentary record thinner than any genealogist would prefer. That thinness is not a flaw in this list. It is the actual condition of the evidence for anyone researching Jamestown's earliest years. Somewhere between 500 and 600 people are estimated to have lived inside or near James Fort in the months before the siege began, and the surviving written record names perhaps a few dozen of them with any real specificity, a fraction produced almost entirely by the Virginia Company's own bookkeeping, by George Percy's later account, and by the sworn muster the colony conducted more than a decade afterward to inventory who remained. Most of the roughly 440 people who did not survive that winter left no name in any surviving document at all. They arrived on a ship, and they are simply absent from the next list taken. Understanding that asymmetry matters for anyone chasing a family connection to this period, because the survivors we can name were, disproportionately, the colonists whose social position, land grants, or later notoriety generated paperwork. Common laborers, servants, and the poorer colonists who made up much of the original 500 are the least documented group in the entire record, meaning the 15 names on this list skew toward gentry, council members, and the handful of interpreter boys whose unusual placement outside the fort happened to save both their lives and their visibility in the historical account. If you think one of these 15 names belongs somewhere in your own family tree, the starting point is the same one genealogists use for any early Virginia line. Land patents recorded in Virginia's Colonial Land Office, many of which survive and have been digitized, are often the most reliable early record, since a land grant required a name, a date, and usually a stated reason, arrival on a particular ship, years of service, headright claims for bringing over other colonists. Parish registers from the earliest Virginia churches, where they survive, are a second thread, though fire, war, and simple neglect destroyed a considerable share of 17th century Virginia's church records long before anyone thought to protect them for family historians. The Jamestown Society, an organization dedicated specifically to documenting descent from colonists who arrived before the 1622 uprising, maintains one of the more rigorous documentation standards available for exactly this kind of claim, and a family Bible or an oral tradition naming one of these 15 surnames is a starting hypothesis, not a conclusion, until it can be checked against that kind of primary record. The starving time itself occupies an odd place in how Americans are taught their own origin story. The Jamestown most people learn about in school is the Jamestown of John Smith's early trading voyages, of Pocahontas, of the first representative assembly convened in 1619, a narrative that tends to skip directly from the colony's founding to its eventual success, with the worst winter in its history compressed into a single grim sentence, if it appears at all. The archaeological find that opened this account, the cut bones of a 14-year-old girl identified through isotope analysis and forensic examination in 2012, did not tell historians anything George Percy had not already written down 4 centuries earlier. What it did was force a confirmation that could no longer be waved away as exaggeration or wartime propaganda written to excuse the colony's failures to its investors back in London. The bones matched the account. The starvation was real, the desperation was real, and the 60 or so people who walked out of that fort in May of 1610 carried names that, in a small number of documented cases, are still being carried by their descendants across Virginia and the wider country today. None of this required inventing anything, and that matters before we close. Every name on this list appears in a surviving primary source, a muster record, a company ledger, a land patent, or a first-hand account written by someone who was there. Some of those documentary threads are stronger than others, and we have tried to be honest about which is which rather than smoothing over the gaps for the sake of a cleaner story. Percy, Martin, and Collier rest on records about as solid as 17th century Virginia produces. Poole and Todkill rest on something closer to a documented before and a documented after, with the winter itself inferred rather than directly attested. That difference matters if you are building a family tree, and it is the difference this account tries to hold on to. Evidence on one side, plausible reconstruction clearly marked as such on the other, and nothing invented to fill the space between them. 60 people walked out of that fort in May of 1610. A meaningful number of living Americans can trace a documented line back to a Jamestown colonist from these earliest years, according to genealogical societies that track this specific migration. If your family has always told a story about being in Virginia since the beginning, there is a real chance the beginning your family means is this one, the winter that nearly ended the colony before it had properly started. One more thing worth keeping in view before we end. The starving time did not happen in isolation, and neither did the survival of these 15 names. The winter of 1609 into 1610 sits inside a longer Anglo-Powhatan conflict that would flare again violently in 1622, meaning several of the men on this list who survived the famine were later killed in the very same conflict that had caused it. Nathaniel Powell and John Ratcliffe both died at Powhatan, hands on either side of that famine winter, one before it, one 12 years after. The names that lasted were not simply the names of the lucky, they were the names attached to people who kept showing up in a record that had every reason to lose track of them. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.